The wind across the Kansas plains in the autumn of 1871 carried more than the smell of turned earth and dying wheat. It carried whispers. It carried the kind of silence that makes a man check over his shoulder even when he knows he is alone. It carried the weight of something wrong, something that had settled into the land like a sickness into bone. The town of Ashford's mill sat low in a valley, where Blackwater Creek cut through fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was a settlement of perhaps 200 souls, most of them farmers who had come west after the war, looking to forget what they had seen in places like Shiloh and Antietam. They had come seeking clean land and clean work, the kind of labor that might wash the stains from their hands and the screams from their dreams. What they found was soil that fought back, winters that came early and stayed late, and summers so hot the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. But they stayed. They always stayed. Because leaving meant admitting defeat, and these were men and women who had already surrendered too much. Thomas Mercer had arrived in Ashford's mill in the spring of 1869, bringing with him a wagon, a plow, and a silence that his wife Sarah had learned not to question. He had been a lieutenant in the Union cavalry, though he never spoke of it. The only evidence of those years was a scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone, a memento from a Confederate saber at Yellow Tavern. He had purchased 80 acres on the eastern edge of town, land that the previous owner had abandoned after a single season. The man had left in the night, people said, without even bothering to collect his belongings. Just climbed onto his horse and rode east until the town was nothing but a memory. Thomas should have wondered why. He did not. He was too busy trying to forget. The first year was hard but manageable. The wheat came up thin and pale, but it came up. Sarah planted a garden near the house, a small structure of raw timber, and hoped that Thomas had built with his own hands. They had no children, a fact that Sarah carried like a stone in her chest. But they had each other, and in those early months, that seemed like enough. Thomas worked from dawn until long after dusk, breaking the stubborn earth, clearing rocks that seemed to multiply overnight, building fences that the wind knocked down with casual contempt. By the second summer, he had managed to cultivate nearly 40 acres. The wheat grew taller, though it still had a sickly yellow tinge that troubled him. He mentioned it once to Ezra Hammond, who ran the general store in town, and Ezra had simply shrugged. "Land's got a mood," he had said, weighing out nails with hands that never stopped trembling. Sometimes it wants to give, sometimes it don't. It was in August of 1870 that Thomas began to notice the scarecrows. Every farmer had them, of course. Crude effigies stuffed with straw and dressed in cast-off clothes, their arms spread wide in a parody of crucifixion. They stood sentinel over the fields, meant to frighten away the crows that descended in black clouds each evening, cawing and shrieking as they stripped the wheat down to stubble. Thomas had built 3 of them himself, using old shirts and trousers that Sarah had mended past the point of further repair. He had carved faces into gourds, giving them hollow eyes and stitched mouths, and mounted them on posts of rough-cut pine. But there were more scarecrows in his field than he remembered building. He first noticed it on a Tuesday, walking the northern fence line at sunrise. The light was thin and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph, drained of color and warmth. He had been checking for breaks in the wire when he saw it, standing about 30 yards into the wheat. A scarecrow he did not recognize. It was taller than his others, and it wore a coat that looked almost new, a heavy canvas duster that hung to its knees. Its face was a burlap sack with 2 ragged holes cut for eyes, and beneath the brim of a wide felt hat, those holes seemed to watch him. Thomas stood very still, his breath fogging in the cool air. He told himself he was mistaken. He had built that scarecrow and simply forgotten. The days bled together out here, one indistinguishable from the next. It was easy to lose track. But as he stood there, squinting across the field, he realized something that made his skin prickle. The coat the scarecrow wore, that canvas duster, looked exactly like the one Jacob Thornley had been wearing the last time anyone saw him. Jacob Thornley had been a farmhand, a young man of perhaps 25 with a weak chin and a tendency to drink more than he should. He had worked for old Samuel Pritchard, whose land bordered Thomas's to the north. Jacob had gone missing in late July, simply failed to show up for work one morning. Pritchard had found his horse tied to a fence post, still saddled, but there was no sign of Jacob himself. The sheriff, A rotund man named Coleman, who seemed perpetually exhausted by the responsibilities of his office, had organized a search party. They had combed the surrounding fields and the cottonwood breaks along the creek, but found nothing. After 3 days, Coleman had declared it a lost cause. Probably rode off to Topeka, he had said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had once been white. Young men get restless. It happens. But Jacob's horse had still been there, and now his coat was on a scarecrow in Thomas Mercer's field. Thomas walked out into the wheat, the stalks rustling against his legs like dry whispers. Up close, the scarecrow seemed even taller, looming against the pale sky. The duster was definitely the same one. Thomas recognized the torn pocket, the missing button on the left cuff. He reached out slowly and touched the fabric. It was cold, much colder than the morning air would account for, and it was damp, as if it had been left out in a rain that had never fallen. He pulled his hand back. The scarecrow's burlap face stared down at him with those empty eyes. In the silence, Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, a dull thud that seemed too loud, too insistent. He looked down at the base of the post. The earth around it was disturbed, darker than the surrounding soil, and there was a smell rising from it, faint but unmistakable. The smell of turned earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. Thomas backed away. He told himself he would mention it to Coleman, ask if Jacob had perhaps returned and donated his coat to someone. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation. He did not believe it. Over the next 2 weeks, more scarecrows appeared. Thomas began keeping count. There had been 3 originally. Now there were 8, then 11. By the end of August, there were 15 figures standing throughout his 40 acres, their arms outstretched, their faces turned toward the house. Sarah noticed them too. She mentioned it one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink into a red horizon that looked like a wound. "You've been busy," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Thomas said nothing. He had not built any new scarecrows. He had not touched the ones that were already there. "They're keeping the crows away at least," Sarah added, but her tone suggested she did not find this comforting. Thomas counted them again the next morning. 17. He rode into town that afternoon, the horse plodding along the rutted road with its head low. Ashford's mill looked even more desolate than usual. The buildings hunched and gray beneath a sky that threatened rain, but never delivered. Thomas found Sheriff Coleman in his office, a cramped room that smelled of tobacco and old sweat. Coleman was asleep in his chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his hands folded across his considerable belly. Thomas cleared his throat. Coleman did not stir. Thomas cleared his throat again, louder. Coleman snorted, shifted, and finally opened one eye. "Mercer," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "What brings you to town?" Thomas hesitated. Now that he was here, the words seemed ridiculous. "I wanted to ask about Jacob Thornley," he said finally. Coleman sighed and pushed his hat back. "Still missing. Probably halfway to California by now." "His coat," Thomas said. "Did anyone find his coat?" Coleman frowned. "His coat? Why would we find his coat? I thought maybe he had left it behind, sold it, given it away. Why do you care about Jacob Thornley's coat?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked out the window at the empty street, at the buildings that seemed to lean toward each other like old men sharing secrets. "No reason," he said. "Just curious." Coleman studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "If you see Jacob, tell him Pritchard wants his wages back." Thomas left without another word. When he returned home, Sarah was in the garden, kneeling among the withered tomato plants. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the sun. "Did you find out anything?" "No," Thomas said. He looked out at the field. 18 scarecrows now. He was certain. 18 figures standing in the wheat like sentinels, like witnesses, like accusations. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind move through the fields, a low moan that sounded almost like voices. Sarah slept beside him, her breathing soft and steady, but Thomas stared at the ceiling and counted the minutes until dawn. At some point, he must have drifted off, because he woke suddenly to find the room filled with pale gray light. He sat up, disoriented, and looked toward the window. A scarecrow stood just outside, its face pressed against the glass. Thomas's heart stopped. For several seconds he could not move, could not breathe. The scarecrow's burlap face was flattened against the window, the ragged eye holes gaping, and in the dim light, Thomas could see something behind the burlap. Something that might have been a face, a real face. Then Sarah stirred beside him, murmuring in her sleep, and Thomas blinked. When he looked again, the window was empty, just the pale sky and the distant line of the fields. He got up, dressed quickly, and went outside. The ground beneath the window was undisturbed. No footprints, no marks in the dirt. He walked out into the field as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the wheat. The scarecrows stood where they had always stood, motionless and silent. 19 of them now. Thomas began to avoid the fields. He found reasons to stay close to the house, to work on the fences near the road, to repair the roof of the small barn. Sarah watched him with growing concern, but she did not ask questions. She had learned in the 2 years of their marriage that there were places inside Thomas that she could not reach, rooms he had locked and thrown away the keys. But the scarecrows did not need him to tend them. They appeared on their own, 1 or 2 each day until the field was crowded with them. Thomas stopped counting after 30. There were too many. They stood in rows, their faces all turned toward the house, and in the evenings when the light grew long and strange, they cast shadows that seemed to move independently, creeping across the ground like spilled ink. It was Ezra Hammond who finally spoke the thing that everyone in Ashford's mill had been thinking, but no one had been willing to say. Thomas had gone into town for supplies, though he had been putting it off for days. He needed nails and flour and lamp oil, necessities that could not be delayed any longer. Ezra weighed out the flour with his trembling hands and wrapped it in brown paper, his eyes flicking up to Thomas's face, and then away again. "Heard you got a lot of scarecrows out on your place," Ezra said, his voice careful. Thomas did not reply. He watched Ezra's hands measure out the nails, counting each one as if it mattered. "Heard there's more than there used to be," Ezra continued. "Heard you've been building them day and night." "I haven't built any," Thomas said quietly. Ezra's hands stopped moving. He looked up, his rheumy eyes searching Thomas's face. "Then who did?" Thomas said nothing. Ezra leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's been talk," he said, "about people going missing. Jacob Thornley for starters, and Mary Sutton, and that drifter who was staying at the boarding house, the one with the limp. People are saying they disappeared, just vanished." "People leave," Thomas said. "It happens." "Not like this," Ezra replied. He glanced toward the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Not all at once, not without taking anything with them." He paused. "And there's something else. The Pritchard boy, Samuel's youngest. He swears he saw Jacob Thornley out in your field last week." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's not possible." "That's what I told him," Ezra said. But he was insistent. Said he saw Jacob standing out there at dusk, just standing among the wheat. Said Jacob's face looked wrong. Said it looked like it was made of straw. Thomas paid for his supplies and left without another word. As he rode home, the sky darkened with clouds that had been gathering all day. By the time he reached his land, the first drops of rain were falling, fat and heavy, striking the ground with soft thuds. He found Sarah standing at the edge of the field, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She was staring out at the scarecrows, dozens of them now, standing in the rain like penitents. "Thomas," she said without looking at him, "do you see it?" "See what?" "They're not just scarecrows anymore." Thomas dismounted and walked to stand beside her. The rain was falling harder now, turning the world gray and indistinct. He looked out at the field, at the figures standing among the wheat, and he understood what Sarah meant. They were not just effigies, they were monuments. Each one was different, distinct, dressed in clothes that he recognized. There was Jacob Thornley's canvas duster. There was Mary Sutton's blue gingham dress. There was the drifter's bowler hat, the one he had worn pulled low over his eyes. And there were others, clothes Thomas did not recognize but which must have belonged to someone, must have been worn by people who had names and lives and families. "How many people have gone missing?" Sarah whispered. Thomas did not know. He had lost count. The scarecrows stood in the rain, their arms outstretched, their faces hidden beneath burlap and sackcloth. The rain ran down their bodies like tears, pooling at the bases of the posts. That night the wind picked up, howling around the house with a fury that shook the walls. Thomas lay awake, listening to Sarah's frightened breathing beside him. Somewhere in the darkness, something was moving. He could hear it, a soft rustling like footsteps in straw. He rose and went to the window. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, he could see the field, and he could see the scarecrows. They were closer now. They had moved. They stood in a semicircle around the house, their faces all turned inward, watching. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. He wanted to wake Sarah, to tell her what he was seeing, but he could not make himself speak. He could only stand there frozen as the scarecrows drew nearer. And then he saw the faces. Beneath the burlap, beneath the sackcloth, there were faces. Real faces, gray and sunken, with eyes that had filmed over and mouths that hung slack. They were the faces of the missing: Jacob Thornley, Mary Sutton, the drifter, and others. So many others. They stared at the house with those dead eyes, and Thomas understood, with a certainty that made his knees weak, that they were not effigies at all. They were the missing themselves, transformed, twisted into something that was neither living nor dead. They had been taken by the land, absorbed into it, and now they stood as warnings, as markers, as evidence of the hunger that lived in this soil. Thomas staggered back from the window. He had to leave. He had to get Sarah and leave this place, ride through the night if necessary, put as much distance between themselves and this cursed field as possible. But when he turned to wake Sarah, he found her standing in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight. "They were here before we came," she said softly. "Weren't they?" Thomas nodded slowly. "The man who owned this land before me. He knew. That's why he left. And now they want us," Sarah said. It was not a question. Thomas did not answer. He did not need to. In the silence, they could both hear it, the soft rustling of straw and cloth, the whisper of movement just beyond the walls. The scarecrows were at the door. For 3 days, Thomas and Sarah did not leave the house. They barricaded the door with furniture and kept the windows shuttered. They rationed the food they had, eating sparingly, speaking in whispers. At night, they could hear the scarecrows moving around the house, their footsteps soft and patient. During the day, Thomas peered through cracks in the shutters and saw them standing in the yard, in the garden, at the edge of the porch, waiting. On the 4th day, the food ran out. Thomas knew they could not wait any longer. They would have to make a run for it, try to reach the horse and ride for town. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan they had. He told Sarah, and she nodded, her face drawn and exhausted. They prepared in silence, gathering what little they could carry. At dawn, Thomas unbarricaded the door. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely lift the furniture. Sarah stood behind him, clutching a small bag that held her mother's Bible and a handful of keepsakes. Thomas looked back at her once, memorizing her face, and then he pulled open the door. The scarecrows stood in a line across the porch, blocking their way. There were dozens of them, their burlap faces eyeless and accusing. Thomas could see Jacob Thornley at the front, his canvas duster soaked with rain that had never stopped falling. Beside him was Mary Sutton, her gingham dress stained with earth. The drifter stood at the end, his bowler hat tilted at an angle that was almost jaunty. Thomas took a step forward. The scarecrows did not move. He took another step, and another, until he was standing directly in front of Jacob Thornley. Up close, he could see the details he had been trying not to see. The hands that hung from the sleeves were not made of straw. They were real hands, desiccated and gray, the nails cracked and black. The face beneath the burlap was real too, the skin stretched tight over bone, the eyes empty sockets that leaked a thin, dark fluid. "Please," Thomas whispered. "Let us go." Jacob Thornley did not move. None of them moved. They simply stood there, a wall of the dead and the transformed, and Thomas understood that there would be no leaving. The land had claimed them, just as it had claimed everyone who had tried to work this cursed soil, and it would not let them go. Behind him, Sarah made a small sound, a whimper that she tried to suppress. Thomas turned to look at her, and in that moment, the scarecrows moved. They surged forward with a speed that seemed impossible, their hands reaching, their mouths opening to reveal throats stuffed with straw. Thomas tried to fight, tried to push them back, but there were too many. He felt hands on his arms, his legs, his throat, cold and unyielding as iron. He heard Sarah screaming, a sound that cut through the morning air like a blade, and then the sound was muffled, choked off. Thomas struggled, but it was like fighting the earth itself. The scarecrows bore him down, dragging him off the porch and into the field. He could feel the wheat stalks breaking beneath him, could smell the turned earth and the rot that rose from it. His vision was fading, going gray at the edges, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the sky, pale and indifferent, stretching away to infinity. When Sheriff Coleman finally rode out to the Mercer place a week later, prompted by complaints from Samuel Pritchard about the wheat going unharvested, he found the house abandoned. The door stood open, swinging in the wind with a rhythmic creak that seemed to mark time itself. Inside, the furniture was pushed against the walls, as if someone had been trying to block an entrance. The chairs were overturned. A table had been dragged across the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. But there was something else, something that made Coleman's skin crawl even though he could not have named it. The air inside the house was wrong. It was too cold, even for autumn, and it carried a smell that reminded him of turned earth after a rain, of root cellars and graves. Coleman searched the house methodically, his boots echoing on the wooden floors, but found nothing. The beds were made. Clothes hung in the wardrobe. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, a thin film of mold growing across its surface. It was as if the Mercers had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. But Coleman knew that was not what had happened. He had seen enough in his years as sheriff to recognize the signs of something terrible, even when those signs were nothing more than absence, nothing more than the empty spaces where people used to be. It was only when he stepped outside and looked across the field that he noticed the scarecrows. There were so many of them, dozens, perhaps hundreds, standing among the wheat in neat rows. Coleman walked out into the field, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, though he could not have said what he expected to shoot. The scarecrows stared down at him with their blank faces, and as he passed among them, Coleman felt a prickling at the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched by something that was not quite alive, but not quite dead either. He stopped in front of one of the scarecrows. It was taller than the others, dressed in clothes that looked oddly familiar. A work shirt that might have been brown once but had faded to the color of old bone. Trousers held up with rope. Boots that were cracked and worn. Coleman stared at it for a long moment, trying to place where he had seen those clothes before. And then he noticed the hands. They hung from the sleeves, and they were not made of straw. They were real hands, weathered and calloused, with dirt beneath the nails. Coleman took a step back, his heart beginning to pound. He looked up at the scarecrow's face, at the burlap sack that covered it, and with a trembling hand, he reached up and pulled the sack away. Thomas Mercer stared back at him, or what had been Thomas Mercer. The face was gray and sunken, the eyes glassy and unseeing. The mouth hung open, revealing a throat stuffed with wheat stalks and straw. Coleman stumbled backward, the burlap sack falling from his hand. He looked around wildly at the dozens of scarecrows standing in the field, and he understood with a horror that made his stomach turn that they were all like this. Every single one of them. He turned and ran, crashing through the wheat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear a rustling, a soft whisper of movement, as if the scarecrows were turning to watch him go. He did not look back. He ran until he reached his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and rode for town as if the devil himself were at his heels. When he reached Ashford's mill, he went directly to the saloon and drank until he could not remember what he had seen. He never went back to the Mercer place. No one did. The land was left to go fallow, the wheat rotting in the fields, the house slowly collapsing under the weight of wind and time. But the scarecrows remained. They stood in that field for years, slowly deteriorating, their clothes falling to rags, their bodies collapsing into the earth. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew from the east, people in Ashford's mill would swear they could hear voices carried on the air, whispers that sounded like warnings, like pleas, like the last words of the missing, calling out from the field where every scarecrow looked like someone who had never been found. The years passed, as years do, and the story of Thomas and Sarah Mercer became a ghost story, the kind that parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far from home. The field itself became a place of dread, a boundary that no one crossed. Ashford's mill slowly died, as so many frontier towns did, its population dwindling as people moved west or east or simply gave up. By 1880, fewer than 50 people remained. By 1890, the town was empty, its buildings stripped for lumber or left to the mercy of the elements. But the field remained, and so did the scarecrows. In the spring of 1895, a surveyor named Patrick Delaney was sent by the railroad company to map a route through central Kansas. He was a practical man, educated at a technical college in Philadelphia, who believed in straight lines and measurable distances. He did not believe in ghost stories. When his work brought him to the outskirts of what had once been Ashford's mill, he camped for the night in the ruins of what might have been a church or a meeting hall. The walls were mostly intact, and the roof, though sagging, still provided some shelter. That night, Delaney built a small fire and heated a can of beans. As he ate, he looked out across the darkening prairie and saw, in the distance, what appeared to be a field of wheat. It was overgrown and wild, but unmistakably wheat, golden even in the fading light. And standing among the wheat were shapes, tall and still, that Delaney first took to be trees. But there were no trees on the Kansas plains, not this far from water. Curious, Delaney finished his meal, banked his fire, and walked out toward the field. The evening was warm, the air heavy with the smell of dry grass and dust. As he drew closer, he realized that the shapes were not trees but scarecrows, dozens of them, standing in rows that stretched as far as he could see in the dimming light. They were ancient, their clothes hanging in tatters, their posts leaning at drunken angles. Most had lost their heads, the gourds or sacks or whatever had served as faces long since rotted away. Delaney walked among them, his surveyor's instincts cataloging their positions, estimating their numbers. There had to be at least 100, maybe more. It seemed excessive for a single field, and he wondered briefly what kind of farmer would go to such trouble. Then he noticed something that made him stop. One of the scarecrows was wearing a badge. It was tarnished and half buried in the straw that spilled from the scarecrow's chest, but Delaney could make out the shape of a star, the word sheriff, engraved in letters that had been worn almost smooth. He reached out and touched the badge. It was real, solid metal, cold beneath his fingers. He looked up at the scarecrow's face, or what remained of it. The burlap had rotted away, revealing beneath it a skull, bleached white by sun and time. The skull grinned at him, empty-eyed, and Delaney felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the evening. He backed away from the scarecrow and looked around. In the fading light, the field seemed different, more menacing. The scarecrows no longer looked like simple effigies. They looked like markers, like graves. Delaney turned and walked quickly back to his camp. He did not run, because he was a practical man, and practical men did not run from superstition. But he walked fast, and he did not look back. That night, he lay in his bedroll and stared up at the stars, and told himself that what he had seen was simply the remains of an old field, that the badge had probably fallen off a scarecrow and been picked up and reattached by some passing drifter as a joke. He told himself this, but he did not believe it. In the morning, Delaney packed his equipment and continued his survey, giving the field a wide berth. He made note of it on his map, marking it with a simple annotation: field, abandoned, a void. When he returned to the railroad office in Topeka, he submitted his report and said nothing about the scarecrows, or the badge, or the feeling of being watched that had followed him for miles after he left that place. The railroad was built along a different route. The field was left alone. In 1902, a photographer named Elizabeth Marsh traveled through Kansas, documenting the abandoned settlements that dotted the plains. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and an artist's sensibility, and she was drawn to places that others avoided. When she heard about the ghost town of Ashford's mill and its cursed field, she decided it would make an excellent subject for her work. She arrived on a gray afternoon in October, when the light was thin and the wind carried the smell of coming snow. The town was a ruin, its buildings collapsed or collapsing, the streets choked with weeds. Elizabeth set up her camera in the center of what had once been the main street and took several photographs, capturing the decay, the emptiness, the sense of time grinding everything down to dust. Then she walked out to the field. The wheat was still there, though it had gone completely wild. It grew in thick, tangled masses, rising as high as Elizabeth's waist in some places. And standing among the wheat were the scarecrows, even more numerous than they had been when Patrick Delaney had seen them 7 years before. Elizabeth counted at least 200, maybe more, their posts driven deep into the earth, their arms outstretched in poses that ranged from welcoming to accusing. Elizabeth set up her camera at the edge of the field and began to work. She took photograph after photograph, adjusting her lens, changing her exposure, trying to capture the strange, unsettling beauty of the scene. The scarecrows stood motionless, patient, as if they had been waiting for her, as if they wanted to be remembered. It was only when she was developing the photographs later, in the makeshift darkroom she had set up in her hotel room in Topeka, that she noticed something odd. In every photograph, there were more scarecrows than she remembered seeing. In one image, there appeared to be a figure standing at the very edge of the frame, tall and still, wearing what looked like a woman's dress. Elizabeth did not remember seeing that scarecrow. In another photograph, there was a small figure, child-sized, standing among the wheat, with its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Elizabeth examined the negatives carefully. The figures were there, captured in silver and shadow. They were not defects in the film or tricks of the light. They were real, or as real as anything in a photograph could be. And the more Elizabeth looked at them, the more she became convinced that they were not scarecrows at all, but something else, something that had been human once. She never published those photographs. She locked them away in a trunk, and as far as anyone knows, they remained there until her death in 1934. The trunk and its contents were lost in an estate sale, scattered to the winds, and if those photographs still exist somewhere, no one has come forward to claim them. The field remained. Through droughts and floods, through dust storms that turned the sky black, through the slow, inevitable march of time, the field remained. The scarecrows rotted and fell, but new ones appeared, rising from the earth like some grim harvest. People began to avoid that part of Kansas altogether. It was not marked on most maps. Roads were built around it, and the few who stumbled upon it by accident did not stay long, because there was something wrong with that field, something in the soil, in the air, in the way the light fell across the wheat. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn thin, where the earth itself was hungry, where anyone who stayed too long might find themselves transformed, twisted into something that was no longer quite human. In 1923, a group of students from the University of Kansas, emboldened by youth and skepticism, decided to investigate the legend of the Ashford's Mill Scarecrow Field. There were 5 of them, 3 young men and 2 young women, all of them studying history or anthropology and eager to debunk what they saw as frontier superstition. They drove out in a borrowed Ford, following directions pieced together from old county records and local folklore. They found the field on a warm afternoon in May. The wheat was green and new, and the scarecrows stood like monuments, weathered but still upright. The students parked the car at the side of the road and walked out into the field, laughing and calling to each other, their voices carrying across the empty land. They took photographs with a Kodak Brownie. They collected samples of the wheat. One of the young men, a boy named Robert Hayes, climbed up on one of the scarecrow posts and waved his hat, shouting that he was the king of the field. They left as the sun was setting, driving back to Lawrence with their samples and their photographs and their stories. They were going to write a paper, they said, exposing the legend as nothing more than collective hysteria and the power of suggestion. But Robert Hayes never made it back to Lawrence. Somewhere between the field and the town, he asked the driver to stop the car. He said he felt sick. He got out and walked a few steps away, and then he kept walking. His friends called after him, but he did not respond. He walked into the darkening prairie, and he did not come back. They searched for him. They drove up and down the road, honking the horn, calling his name. They went back to the field and searched there too, but found nothing. Eventually, they gave up and drove to the nearest town to report him missing. The sheriff organized a search party, and they combed the area for 3 days, but Robert Hayes was never found. The other 4 students never wrote their paper. They never spoke of what had happened, not publicly. But years later, one of the young women, a teacher named Margaret Fuller, told her grandchildren about the day they had visited the cursed field. She told them how Robert had seemed different after they left, how his eyes had looked strange, unfocused, as if he were seeing something the rest of them could not see. She told them how he had walked away into the prairie without a word, without a backward glance, as if something were calling him. And she told them that 3 weeks after Robert disappeared, she had received a letter from the sheriff in the county, where Ashford's mill had once stood. The letter said that a new scarecrow had appeared in the field, dressed in clothes that matched the description of what Robert Hayes had been wearing the day he vanished. The field continued to wait. It had patience, the kind of patience that comes from being rooted deep in the earth, from existing beyond the brief span of human life. It waited through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, through all the changes that swept across the American landscape. And it collected. Every few years, someone would disappear in that part of Kansas. A drifter, a traveling salesman, a young couple on a road trip. Sometimes their vehicles would be found, abandoned on the side of the road. Sometimes there would be no trace of them at all. But in the field, the scarecrows multiplied. By 1950, there were so many scarecrows that they covered nearly 100 acres, standing shoulder to shoulder in some places, their arms intertwined. From a distance, in certain lights, they looked almost like a crowd, like the population of a small town gathered for some grim celebration. Local farmers avoided the area. They called it the dead field, or sometimes just the field, as if there were no need for further clarification. Everyone knew what it meant. In 1967, the state of Kansas sent a team of agricultural inspectors to investigate reports of blight in the area. The team consisted of 4 men, all experienced in dealing with plant diseases and soil contamination. They drove out to the field on a cold morning in November, their truck loaded with testing equipment and sample containers. They never returned. A search party found the truck parked at the side of the road, the engine still running, the doors hanging open. The testing equipment was scattered on the ground, and there were signs of a struggle, footprints leading away into the field. But the search party did not follow the footprints. They stood at the edge of the field, looking out at the scarecrows, and something in the air, some quality of the silence, made them turn back. The field was officially declared off-limits. Signs were posted warning of contaminated soil and dangerous terrain. A fence was built, though it did not last long. The wind tore it down, or perhaps something else did. The signs were taken down, or vandalized, or simply disappeared. And the field remained, patient and hungry, waiting for the next visitors. In the decades that followed, the legend of the Scarecrow field spread beyond Kansas. It became the subject of articles and magazines devoted to the paranormal, of episodes on radio shows that specialized in the strange and unexplained. People came from all over the country to see it, drawn by curiosity or a desire to prove their courage. Most of them took one look at the field and turned back. A few ventured in, walking among the scarecrows, taking photographs, laughing nervously. Some of them came back out. Some did not. Those who did return often spoke of feeling watched, of hearing whispers in a language they could not understand, of seeing movement among the scarecrows when there should have been none. They spoke of a heaviness in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, a sense of wrongness that settled into their bones like cold. And they spoke of the faces. Because if you looked closely enough, if you were brave or foolish enough to pull away the burlap or the sackcloth that covered the scarecrows' heads, you would see that beneath it, there were faces. Real faces, gray and desiccated, with empty eyes and mouths frozen in expressions of terror or resignation or something that might have been acceptance. The field where every scarecrow looked like someone still missing. That was what people called it, because that was the truth of it. Every figure standing in that wheat was someone who had been taken, someone who had vanished into the Kansas prairie and never been found. They were the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had wandered too far or stayed too long, or simply been unlucky enough to cross paths with a hunger that could not be sated. And they were still there, standing in the wheat, their arms outstretched, waiting for the next traveler, the next curious soul. The next person who would look at that field and think, surely it cannot be as bad as they say. Surely the stories are exaggerated. The land does not exaggerate. The land does not lie. It simply waits, patient and eternal. And when the time comes, it reaches up through the soil and pulls down anyone who dares to disturb it. It transforms them, weaving straw and wheat stalks through their flesh, rooting them to the earth, turning them into guardians of its dark secret. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chen traveled to Kansas to film a segment about American ghost towns. He had heard about Ashford's mill and its infamous field, and he thought it would make a compelling centerpiece for his project. Marcus was a rational man, a skeptic by nature, and he approached the subject with a journalist's detachment. He interviewed locals, pored over historical records, and finally, on a bright afternoon in September, he drove out to the field with his camera crew. The field was exactly as the legends described it. The wheat grew wild and untended, and the scarecrows stood in their hundreds, perhaps their thousands, covering the land like a monument to the forgotten. Marcus and his crew set up their equipment and began filming. They walked among the scarecrows, documenting the decay, the clothes hanging in tatters, the posts leaning drunkenly in the earth. Marcus approached one of the scarecrows and examined it closely. The figure was dressed in a flannel shirt and denim overalls, the fabric faded and torn. He reached up and pulled aside the burlap covering the face, and for a moment, he simply stared. Then he stepped back, his face pale, and turned to his crew. "We're leaving," he said. His crew protested. They had driven all this way, set up all the equipment. They needed more footage. But Marcus was insistent. He packed up the cameras himself, throwing equipment into the truck with shaking hands. When one of his crew members asked what he had seen under the burlap, Marcus shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "I saw nothing." But later, when he was editing the footage, Marcus paused on a frame that showed the scarecrow he had examined. In the brief moment before he pulled the burlap aside, the camera had captured something. Beneath the fabric, there was a face. A human face, gray and lifeless, with eyes that seemed to stare directly into the lens. Marcus deleted the footage. He scrapped the entire documentary. He never returned to Kansas. The field remains. It will always remain. Because the hunger in the soil is not something that can be killed or exorcised or simply ignored until it goes away. It is part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of the earth, a consequence of something that happened long ago, before the farmers came, before Ashford's mill was built, before there were towns or roads or fences to mark the boundaries of the civilized world. Some say it began with the tribes who lived there first, who knew that certain places were sacred and certain places were cursed, and who built no lodges and planted no crops in the valley where Blackwater Creek ran. Some say it began with the war, with the blood that soaked into the soil at battles fought nearby, with the prayers of dying men that fell on deaf ears. Some say it began with nothing more than time, with the slow accumulation of violence and death and sorrow that marks any place where people have lived and struggled and failed. But whatever the cause, the result is the same. The field takes what it wants. It transforms the living into the dead, or something in between. And it marks each one with a scarecrow, a monument to the missing, a warning to anyone who might come after. If you drive through central Kansas today, you might pass near the place where Ashford's mill once stood. There are no signs to mark it, no historical plaques to tell you what happened there. The town is gone, erased by time and weather, and the simple indifference of the world to the fates of small places. But if you know where to look, if you venture off the main roads and follow the old wagon paths that still cut through the prairie, you might find it. The field where the wheat grows wild, the field where the scarecrows stand. And if you are foolish enough to stop, to get out of your car and walk among those silent figures, you might notice something strange. You might notice that the scarecrows are not all old. Some of them are wearing clothes that are too modern, jackets made of synthetic fabrics, shoes with rubber soles. You might notice that the posts they stand on are not all weathered and gray, but some are new, the wood still pale and raw. And you might realize, in that moment, that the field is still hungry, that it is still waiting, that it will always be waiting, patient and eternal, for the next person to cross the boundary between the known and the unknown, the living and the dead. You might realize this, and if you are wise, you will turn and walk away. You will get back in your car and drive until the field is far behind you, until you can no longer see the scarecrows in your rearview mirror. And you will tell yourself that it was just a field, just some old effigies left over from a forgotten farm. But you will know the truth. You will know that in the deep places of the earth, in the soil and the roots and the darkness beneath, there are things that wait, things that hunger, things that will take you if you let them, and transform you into a warning for the next traveler, the next curious soul who wanders too far from the safety of the road. You will know that in Kansas, in a field that no longer appears on any map, there are scarecrows that stand in the wheat, and every single one of them looks like someone who is still missing, someone who vanished without a trace, someone whose family still wonders what happened to them, still holds out hope that they might return. But they will not return. They cannot return, because they are part of the field now, rooted deep in the hungry earth, their arms outstretched in a gesture that might be a warning or might be a welcome. The field does not care. It simply waits, as it has always waited, as it will always wait. And when you are gone, when your footsteps have faded and your tire tracks have been smoothed away by the wind, the scarecrows will still be standing. Silent, patient, eternal, waiting for the next one, always waiting. The wind moves through the wheat with a sound like whispered names. The sun rises and sets. The seasons turn. And in a field in Kansas, where the boundary between the living and the dead has worn thin as paper, the scarecrows stand in their rows, their faces turned toward the road, their empty eyes watching for travelers. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some places are meant to be left alone, avoided, forgotten. But there will always be someone who does not believe. Someone who thinks the stories are exaggerations, that the warnings are superstitions, that surely, it cannot be as bad as they say, and the field will be waiting for them. It will always be waiting, because the hunger in the soil is older than memory and deeper than despair, and it can never be filled. It can only be fed, one soul at a time, one vanished life at a time, until the field is crowded with monuments to the missing, until the scarecrows stand so thick that they blot out the sun. This is the truth of the cursed frontier. This is the secret that the land keeps. In the places where civilization falters, where the structures of law and reason and human community cannot hold, there are other laws, older and more terrible. And those who violate them, who trespass on ground that was never meant for human feet, will pay the price. They will become part of the warning, part of the landscape of dread, part of the field where every scarecrow looks like someone still missing. And on certain nights, when the wind blows from the east and the moon is dark and the stars seem farther away than they should be, you can hear them, the scarecrows, calling out in voices that are not quite human, that are made of rustling straw and creaking wood and the whisper of wheat in the darkness. They are calling your name. They have been calling for a long time, and if you listen closely enough, if you let yourself believe in the impossible, you might find yourself drawn to them. You might find your feet carrying you off the road, across the empty prairie, toward the field that waits in the darkness. And then you will understand. You will understand what Thomas Mercer understood as the scarecrows pulled him down into the earth. You will understand what all the others understood in those final moments before the transformation began. You will understand that there is no escape, no mercy, no hope of rescue. There is only the field. There is only the hunger. There is only the endless waiting, the arms outstretched, the face covered in burlap, the body rooted deep in soil that will never let you go. This is the legacy of Ashford's mill. This is the curse that was spoken, or perhaps simply acknowledged, when the first settler looked at that valley and thought it would make a good place for a farm. This is what happens when people forget that the land is not theirs, that it belongs to itself, that it has its own wants and needs and appetites. The scarecrows remember. They stand in the field and they remember, and they wait for you to forget. Because forgetting is easy. Remembering is hard. And in the space between memory and oblivion, in that twilight realm where the past becomes legend and legend becomes myth, the truth waits patiently to be rediscovered. The field is still there. The scarecrows are still standing. And somewhere, perhaps very soon, someone will drive past on their way to somewhere else. They will see the wheat growing wild. They will see the figures standing among the stalks. And they will think just for a moment about stopping, about taking a closer look, about proving to themselves that there is nothing to fear. And the field will smile if such a thing could smile. And the scarecrows will wait, as they have always waited. And the wind will carry the whispered names of all the missing across the endless Kansas prairie. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, but they will be crossed anyway. And when they are, the field will be there, patient and hungry and eternal, ready to transform the living into monuments to the dead, ready to add one more scarecrow to the rows that stretch to the horizon, one more face hidden beneath burlap, one more name added to the list of the missing, one more soul claimed by the cursed frontier, where the boundary between life and death is as thin as straw and just as easily broken.